Kaylee is excused today. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll call to order. We just went through the roll call, and we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, the Wausau Police Disciplinary Procedures Citizen Complaints Process. It looks like Captain Baton is going to be taking us on that one.
Yes.
All right, take us away, Todd.
Great, thank you. Oh, and we're already up there. The presentation is there. This one. Well, thanks for letting me be here today. I'm Todd Baton. I'm the patrol captain for the Wausau Police Department and have been asked to talk a little bit about our citizen complaint procedure and some of our disciplinary procedures as well at the police department. See if this clicker is working to advance. Kristen, we're not, no, it was earlier. Not quite.
No, try.
The presentation is longer than this slide. See if we can get it to advance here. While we're waiting for that next slide to come up, I just wanted to make a point about really all of these items, or at least the complaint procedure and our disciplinary procedures, hinging on accountability within the police department. Accountability is one of our core values at the police department. Let's see if it works. There we go. In fact, our vision statement talks a little bit about being regarded as the standard of excellence in policing. To me, that denotes a constant progress. And with constant progress comes mistakes and learning by trial and error, and so accountability is really an important piece of that. And then finally, our law enforcement oath of honor reads in part, I will always have the courage to hold myself and others accountable for our actions. So really, accountability is at the heart of what we're about at the police department. So going to go through policy 1010, and there is a lot of information in there. It's my understanding in the past that this policy, among several other policies, has been made available to this task force. So I'm going to just kind of skip through a lot of it, but for our purposes today, there's several words, or at least phrases, that we're going to hear a few times. So I'm going to throw them up here just by way of brief definition, so when you hear them, you understand them in context, what I'm talking about as we use them within the context of this policy. So first of all, we have a procedural complaint. A procedural complaint is something that would be based primarily on actions. So something like a concern over parking enforcement or the towing of a vehicle, something along those lines, a procedural matter. A minor complaint is going to be based primarily on conduct, alleging deliberate or neglectful but minor violations of policy. So that could be something along the lines of rudeness, or maybe some attendance issues, traffic violations committed by an officer, etc. And then finally, serious complaint, also based primarily on conduct, but alleging deliberate or neglectful serious violations. So that could be insubordination, dishonesty under oath, or about official matters, use of excessive force, commission of a crime, things of that nature. So our professional standards function, or in other words, our internal affairs function, is really to ensure the integrity of the organization through an internal investigation system and complaint review process. And within that process, all of these groups of people have various responsibilities. So if we look at that first one, the individual responsibilities from our individual staff members include cooperating with investigations, reporting behavior that would constitute procedural, minor, or serious misconduct to a supervisor. Whereas the supervisors, in turn, they have responsibility to conduct preliminary investigations when they are made aware of behavior constituting complaints. They have responsibility to resolve complaints informally if they're able to, or to proceed with the complaint process, along with categorizing complaints as being procedural, minor, or serious. They also have responsibility to complete professional standards inquiries, or PSIs, for procedural or minor complaints, and to submit to the captain, and also to notify the captain when there's a complaint that comes in that would be categorized as a serious complaint. So the captain, in turn, will coordinate internal investigations of serious complaints, review those professional standards inquiries as submitted by supervisors, first-line supervisors, and then in turn submit those records up to the deputy chief. The deputy chief will then review and evaluate those inquiries and internal investigations and submit records of complaints to the chief. Now, the chief has, under this policy, has responsibility to assign each of these professional standards inquiries or internal investigations a complaint registry number, or CRN, and to rule on final disposition and apply discipline if necessary in each of these matters, but also to provide notice to employees and complainants of the disposition. Often that piece is delegated or could be delegated to other individuals within the police department. And also to take any other corrective action necessary and to maintain those records, to register and file those complaints at the police department. So, whoops, did I miss a slide here? There we go. So acceptance of complaints at the police department can come really in any form. Individuals can make those complaints in any form. It could come in writing, email, in person, by phone. For me, I guess just from my perspective, a preferred method or a method in which the most information can come forward that's helpful is by submitting a citizen complaint form. Those forms are available at the police department reception. They're available on our website. But regardless which form the complaint takes when it's made, our policy mandates that those complaints will be courteously accepted by any department member and promptly given to the appropriate supervisor. And then also anonymous or third-party complaints should be accepted and investigated to the extent possible. Sometimes that is difficult when we have an individual that will call in what they feel is on behalf of somebody else because they've observed something, but we might not have enough information, at least at the get-go. But we definitely have a responsibility to look into those matters to the best of our ability. The complainant will be periodically informed about the status of that complaint, including but not limited to the acknowledging of receipt of that complaint, periodic progress updates if this is something that's going to take a little while, and then ultimately the final disposition of their complaint. So we do have a little bit of a process flow chart that we work off of that you can see here on the screen. It's probably a little bit small for some of those here in the room to see, but that top one is receiving the complaint, and that's what we just talked about. That's the first step, obviously, in this process. The second step would be to conduct a preliminary investigation. So a preliminary investigation is generally initiated by the first-line supervisor, and this would include perhaps interviewing that complainant or that reporting party, any witnesses potentially, or reviewing any submitted complaint forms. It could also include interviewing any officer or officers involved or named in that complaint, maybe gathering some initial information or statements, looking at any available video like body cam footage or any squad video that might be available or other documentation. And also, if as part of this complaint, observing it or documenting rather any injuries or physical evidence that would support any allegations associated with that complaint. And then as part of the preliminary investigation, supervisor could take any other appropriate action that might be immediately required. So once a supervisor has conducted that preliminary investigation, has been able to determine if this is a procedural, a minor, or a serious complaint, we move on to that next step here. If that complaint is able to be informally resolved, that's great. And really, that happens very, very frequently, that these complaints are able to be informally resolved. A lot of times that just has to do with some of these procedural matters that I mentioned before. There might just be a little bit of a misunderstanding about some of our procedures. Like, for example, if there's a complaint of when my vehicle was stopped at a traffic stop, why did a canine officer come by and walk their dog around, and I found that offensive to me, or whatever the case might be. And if we can explain some of the police procedures that we have, one of those being that we have these fantastic tools in the form of a canine, and we try to deploy them as often as we can in all variety of situations. Just to, we don't want to just bring it out when we know or strongly suspect there's just drugs there, but these dogs will be used in a variety of situations. Sometimes that can can help to resolve that complaint if we explain some of those procedures or some of our practices at the police department. Similar to like a towing situation or maybe a civil issue or something that maybe the police officers don't really have the authority or the ability to resolve in the manner that reporting person would like to see happen. So if that is unable to be informally resolved, we have to ask ourselves, is this a serious complaint per those categories? If it's not, then the supervisor will go ahead and initiate a professional standards inquiry. And some of these forms, for those that are in the room, have been provided just as a reference, just so you can see what those forms look like. There's really nothing too spectacular. They're up here. I have a little bit of an image up on the screen there, rather small. So this is what the professional standards inquiry form looks like. So if a procedural or a minor complaint isn't resolved informally by that supervisor, this form will get completed. And this professional standards inquiry will document the details of that complaint or charges and any inquiry findings. And again, a lot of that will come from probably additional conversations with those involved, additional review of any reports completed or viewing of body cam footage, squad footage, for example. And then when that form is complete, that PSI is forwarded up the chain of command for review. The chief of police will assign a complaint registry number and rules on the final disposition of that inquiry, which part of that may include applying any disciplinary action if necessary in that case. Now, going back to that flow chart, if the serious complaint question is a yes, then that would trigger an internal investigation. So internal investigation is a little bit different from a PSI. This is used by the bureau captain to investigate those allegations of serious misconduct. The employee does not have a right to counsel, as the process is administrative in nature, but they may request and will often then have a union representative present with them. Depending on the factors of this incident, administrative suspension may be deemed appropriate as part of this investigation. The employee should be read the administrative rights or warning form under Garrity, indicating that compelled statements cannot be used in a subsequent criminal proceeding. But then that report, similar to the PSI, is forwarded up the chain of command for review. And then just, again, similar to the PSI, the chief of police will assign a complaint registry number and will rule on the final disposition of that investigation, applying any disciplinary action. However, here's the question here, which people may have is, well, what about a criminal matter, a criminal investigation? So in those internal investigations, the chief of police will need to consider the need for a criminal investigation if it's determined that a crime has occurred. As part of that decision-making process, it'll need to be determined whether that's handled internally by a bureau captain or likely farmed out to an outside agency to look at that matter and investigate it. Likely that internal investigation, if it's already been initiated, would be suspended until that criminal investigation is complete. While the policy does allow for that to run concurrently, the likelihood would be that internal investigation would be suspended. But if those two investigations are proceeding at the same time, they would be conducted by separate investigators, not the same investigator, and info from that internal investigation would not be shared with the criminal investigators. They would go and conduct their own interviews and such of those individuals involved. So at the end of whether it's a PSI, the professional standards inquiry, or an internal investigation, we ultimately get to this point where we have to have some type of a complaint disposition. So within the policy, these are the different definitions, or the different dispositions rather, and how they're defined within policy. So unfounded is an investigation indicates that the allegations are false. Not sustained would be that insufficient evidence to either prove or disprove the allegations was shown. A sustained complaint would show that the allegations are supported by sufficient evidence to conclude that they are true. Exonerated, the investigation indicates that the incident did occur but was justified, lawful, and proper under those circumstances. So context being important there. And then finally, a directive failure. So the investigation reveals, yes, these allegations are true. However, the employee was acting in accordance with established department directives, which would then trigger us to look at that policy and those directives to see what would need to be remedied so that did not happen again. So part of our complaint process is that there's an annual review of all those complaints conducted by the chief of police or his designee. And that's really to look at any patterns of behavior, any tendencies within that year of complaints that might need to be addressed. Again, some of it might be policy related, where some things could be tweaked and updated, and some of it might be some training issues that need to be addressed. If we're seeing, hey, we had a few complaints down this lane, what can we do to tighten up the screws on that and make sure that does not continue? But I'd also like to point out, we just had a recent reaccreditation process that we went through WILEAG, the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Accreditation Group, and that was back in May of 2020. And the assessors that came as part of that reaccreditation did point out that in their estimation throughout their assessment, they determined that our complaint process was being handled very well and that they were pleased with how those complaints were being processed, move along that flow chart, and being handled ultimately. So we were pleased to hear that. Along with, along with our citizen complaints, discipline at times will go hand in hand with that. Under our policy, our discipline procedures are meant to be positive, focused, consistent, fair, and objective, citing that a positive disciplinary system will reinforce excellent behavior in addition to being a corrective system. So we have a few different levels of discipline with this overarching theme of it being a progressive discipline. So we start with counseling or training. Now really counseling is something that probably goes on a daily basis. We always want to be trying to improve, and we want our supervisors to be looking for ways to help our staff members do the very best that they can. So counseling, training, that's an ongoing thing. Coaching. Moving up from there, we have verbal reprimand, a written reprimand, followed by suspension, demotion, and ultimately dismissal or termination. And we'll go through each of these. So counseling or training, again, is influencing employee behavior to achieve our department goals and to achieve that vision of being the standard of excellence in policing. This could be used for off-task behavior, less serious first-time offenses, but I also think it's just part of our everyday business at the police department. We're always looking for ways to coach each other and counsel each other and mentor each other and to become better all the time. This could include some instruction or remedial training. It could include implementation of an employee improvement plan if that was deemed appropriate. It could also include referral to employee assistance program if it was learned or felt that maybe there was something else going on in that individual's life that could benefit from something like that. We also, you'll see that phrase down there, guardian tracking. This is a product that we contract with this company that's a vendor of ours, and it's an online repository for supervisors and our staff to include feedback for our employees. So what it allows a supervisor to do, for example, is to kind of more formally log coaching / counseling sessions with a staff member, or maybe compliments that came in from a citizen that said, hey, this was really a great event. Just want to give a shout out to your staff member. We can document all that there. Or maybe there's an annual evaluation that was completed. We can upload those forms right into Guardian Tracking. Employee goals, progress toward those goals. All of these types of things can be placed into Guardian Tracking. So the employee will actually get an email notification when a new entry was made, and so they can get a real-time sense of this feedback. So in years past, some of these counseling or coaching sessions were a little bit more formally documented on like an employee disciplinary report, in fact, where some of them were quite minor. And this Guardian Tracking has really filled that gap a little bit, or bridged that gap rather, and it allowed us to document those things that maybe weren't necessarily disciplinary in nature, but we definitely wanted to track to see if we were seeing progress toward improvement, and we weren't seeing a pattern of behavior. So moving on from counseling and coaching, we move into some of these punitive disciplinary steps. Verbal reprimand, which could be used for less serious or minor infrequent violations. Moving up from there in a progressive discipline sense, we have written reprimand, which could be used as a second level of discipline for those less serious, minor, infrequent violations. It may also be implemented as a first offense, depending on that violation and the context of it. And then suspension for serious or repeated minor violations, and the duration of those suspensions shall be determined by the chief, and is really based, again, on the seriousness of that misconduct and the details of that incident. And then moving on to these final two, demotion or dismissal. Now, these are actions that are taken by the chief and the Police and Fire Commission in conjunction. So this is for unlawful, unethical behavior, willful or malicious or other behavior that has a significant detrimental effect on the efficiency or operation of the PD, or failure to adequately respond to lesser forms of discipline. And these certainly are matters that are not taken lightly at the police department, that we really look at these, and we are concerned about these matters. We want to make sure that all of our staff are acting and working in accordance with our core values, our mission, and our vision statement. Well, how do we document all of these things? So we do have an employee disciplinary report, which will document all of these types of incidents, including the policy violated or order or law, any employee statements relative to that, any associated reports or other attachments that might be relevant, or other comments. You can see on there, you might not be able to see on the slide presentation, but for those that are here in the room, you should have a copy of that in your packet here. You'll see kind of in that top third there, there's a spot there for the patrol captain, the deputy chief, and the chief to kind of offer some comments there. So, for example, on a sheet like this, when this comes to me, I will date, I will sign, and I might offer my input on there on like what I think would be appropriate based on the details of this investigation, perhaps any other prior issues that this employee had, for example, and I could then offer a suggestion on what might be an appropriate level of discipline for this. And then I would move that on to the deputy chief, who might concur with that, who might offer something other than that as well, and then so on up to the chief of police. So all of this is then documented and ultimately ruled upon and signed, and then maintained in the officer's personnel file in compliance with our personnel files policy. So in addition to this, however, we know that there's concerns about potentially having officers that kind of bounce from department to department, that might have had issues at one department and then go on to another department. So we have this ability within this, again, another online format here, and this is through the Law Enforcement Standards Board, LESB certification system, this ACADIS portal. And this portal is mainly used to document an officer's training. So if I go to a training conference, or I qualify with my firearm, or all those kinds of things, that's documented in this portal, in this statewide portal. But additionally, if I separate employment from the police department, we have the ability then, within that portal, to designate what that suspension, what were the details of that suspension, or in other words, how that would be categorized. So in this case, you can see on the drop down, I believe it says right there, one of the options is resigned in lieu of termination. So that would be a trigger for another agency, if they see that in the ACADIS portal, that this person left the Wausau Police Department or resigned in lieu of termination. That should hopefully be a trigger for them to reach out, to ask some pertinent questions about that. And there's a couple of other options in there as well. I think there's a similar option, something along the lines of resigned while under investigation or something like that. Or there's an active, or resigned in good standing or something along those lines. But that is another safety net of sorts for us to document that information. So here's some numbers. If we go back just a couple of years here, see if I can find I know I have some 2020 numbers here as well. So if you look at 2018, we had 8 formal citizen complaints that were brought forth to the police department. 5 of those were found to be unfounded. 1 received counseling. 1, there was a written reprimand issued, and there was 1 suspension issued. In addition to that, we had 10 informal citizen complaints, and 10 were deemed unfounded. Now, those informal citizen complaints, these were likely phone calls or emails that came in about some of those procedural matters, whether it had to do with a vehicle getting towed or, snow emergency questions or something along those lines, why they might have received a ticket or something along those lines, and we were able to resolve that. On top of that, we also had 16 internal investigations. Now, if you're doing the math here a little bit, you'll see that, well, not all of these could have come from citizen complaints, and that's because they don't. A lot of these situations are really brought forth from first-line supervisors or other officers who want to be associated with working at a place that is all about accountability. So we want to make sure that we're holding each other accountable. So we did have 16 internal investigations in 2018. The results of those are right there: 7 counseling sessions, 5 verbal reprimands, 3 reprimands, and 1 individual resigned in lieu of termination. Then if we go to the next year, 2019, there were 8 formal citizen complaints, 5 unfounded, 3 counseling, 8 informal complaints with 8 unfounded, and 8 internal investigations. And you can see the breakdown there with some counseling, verbal reprimand, 3 written reprimands, a suspension, 1 resigned in lieu of termination, and 1 termination. Now, the year-to-date numbers for 2020 include so far 11 formal complaints. There were 7 informal complaints received so far and 2 internal investigations. And I can tell you this is an ongoing process. I came in this morning and I had an email that indicated that we had a couple of complaints that came in over the weekend. It looks like one of those is going to be able to be resolved pretty quickly through some conversation. And the other one is moving already on into a a professional standards inquiry phase to categorize that complaint and kind of see where that goes. So we do look at all of those and want to make sure that we're above board on everything. Because really the culture that we're trying to create within the police department is not about us being perfect. It's not one of infallibility. It is about constant learning. It's about improving. It's progressing. It's trying to reach that vision of being regarded as the standard of excellence in policing. And discipline and a transparent and robust complaint process is very, very integral to that culture that we've worked hard to create at the police department. Are there any questions? I know I went through a lot of information. I know Deputy Chief Barnes has another topic to present on as well. But any questions at all off the top of your head?
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of smaller questions, but one that came to mind after reviewing the extent of this policy and listening to your very fine presentation. I'm wondering if you feel the average citizen is able to get through this on their own, or if it's an individual who doesn't read very well or doesn't cope with paperwork very well. Is there some process where they would be provided with like an advocate or something to help them actually go through the steps?
Sure. I mean, that's a good question. So, for example, of the couple of complaints that it looks like we received over the weekend that I referenced, one of those was a phone call that just went to dispatch and then was patched through to the patrol lieutenant. And this was an individual that had a concern, and the patrol lieutenant was able to walk that individual through the concern. In fact, what the patrol lieutenant did, just for his own organization, is he took a blank complaint form. Instead of just taking notes on like Post-it notes or whatever, he just took the blank complaint form and just went through that with the individual and was like, okay, well, why don't you tell me when this happened? Let's, get the date, kind of time frame nailed down. What's your address? What's your name? Can you tell me a little bit more about this? And walked through them with that. We do have people that will come in, and I've met with them. Other supervisors have met with them in the interview room off the lobby to really walk them through that process because, yeah, I understand it maybe isn't quite as user-friendly or as intuitive to everybody as we think it is. And we certainly want all individuals to feel comfortable being able to make that complaint in any form that is most comfortable to them. So we will accept those complaints in any form, even if it's just to talk individuals through that.
Should I keep going? You mentioned, and early on in the document, there's a reference to off-task behavior. Would that be behavior not related to police work? Like if I'm driving behind a squad car and I see the driver of the squad car toss a coffee cup out the window and litter, is that off-task behavior?
Yeah, I think I would probably look at that a little bit differently as off-task. I think when I hear that phrase off-task or read that phrase off-task within the policy, to me, that brings to my mind perhaps an officer's assigned to a specific sector in our city, and they have accountability and stewardship for that sector, and we learn maybe they're not going out and taking their calls. They're maybe just sitting parked somewhere for an inordinate amount of time. Now, sometimes we do have squads that are parked and they're completing some paperwork or doing whatever. But we're able to determine, why has this officer been sitting here for this long of time when there's some other things going on in the city? And that would trigger should trigger, from at least the first line supervisor standpoint, some conversation with that staff member to see what is going on. Are we able to, were you working on something? And if not, why is this maybe happened a few times now? Why have I seen that? And do we need to kind of have that conversation to get people back in line?
Thank you. Right under that, I think it's on page 2 of the disciplinary procedures, it says criteria and procedures for punitive action, and it lists what they are. And a critical person could read that as, here are the punitive actions. If you do something bad, you can get a reprimand, et cetera, all the way up to dismissal. And it doesn't mention criminal charges. And the paperwork gets into that, but it doesn't mention it there. It looks like a critical person could read that as, you can do a bunch of bad stuff and the worst we'll do is fire you.
Sure, yeah. So I understand what you're talking about there. I guess I'm not exactly sure how that gets remedied other than through some verbiage, perhaps within that, within the associated paperwork. I will say that some of those things that will get a person fired or at least brought before the Police and Fire Commission, I think inherent within some of those acts could be criminal matters. And we would just act appropriately with those. I mean, all of these cases will be treated on an individual basis based on the merits of each of those individual complaints.
Yeah. Okay, then on the next page.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Deputy Chief might have
Maybe
something.
this will just help clarify a little bit in that context. What you're looking at here is a process for the internal investigation that has to do with their employment as a police officer and what we have the ability as an organization to punitively to address their behaviors. Completely separate from that, and we are actually going to get into this in the next presentation to see how that works, a criminal referral would be something entirely different. It's not the internal employment-related matter that we're dealing with. That's a totally separate animal. Now, it is entirely possible that you could have both. You could have the internal investigation that results in the termination of an employee and a criminal referral that gets forwarded to the district attorney's office and potentially have criminal charges, all from the same act. They're just apples and oranges
Yeah,
to some degree.
and we're creeping into my next question where on the next page
Matt.
talks about formal discipline taken by the Chief of Police and Fire Commission based upon the filing of formal charges by the Chief of Police. Would that be formal criminal charges?
That'd be charges before the Police and Fire Commission. So, for example, I wouldn't have an officer come into my office, this is exaggerated, but I wouldn't have them come in and say, you're fired, you no longer work here. In fact, the chief wouldn't do that. It would be, here's our intention is to bring forth these charges and this information to the Police and Fire Commission. recommending termination or for their consideration to consider
These
termination.
are internal charges,
Ye-
not,
yes.
you're not going to court.
Yes.
You're going to the
Correct.
Police
Correct.
and Fire Commission.
Yes, you are correct.
Okay.
So maybe there was some issues that came up, and you talked about the counseling and the whole concept of the employee plan in DNR, we call it the personal improvement plan.
Yes.
So it's something I like to, from the day I get hired, we've gone through sort of your selection criteria. Can we go through it at some point? So I'm hired, what are my goals? How often are those goals reviewed? How's my performance reviewed? How does that fit in? How does that, because it leads into this process. So if we could, how do, we'd have semi-annual evaluation with a formal annual evaluation and submittal, and you
Yep.
as a supervisor, I would have to take that to my supervisor and have them sign off. So can we just walk through that? Because that filters into the disciplinary process for those that may not perform up to expectations.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. So with a new officer, they're really under a greater degree of scrutiny. Obviously, they're part of a field training process that is months long. They're being evaluated on a daily basis across a whole spectrum of activities and categories. So they're getting their daily feedback and evaluation from their supervisor, who would really be the field trainer in that sense. Upon completion of that field training program, there are closer and more periodic review dates to kind of revisit how they're doing since they've been out on their own in that setting. Additionally, you talked about maybe like an annual evaluation or something like that. So let's take the officer, for example, that has now been there for a year or two. They will have their annual evaluation with their supervisor, during which time there will be those goals, individual goals set for that officer. Some of those goals maybe have to do with productivity. Some of those goals maybe have to do with receiving some training in a discipline that they have some interest in, for example, specializing in a certain area. Now, throughout the year, the patrol officers in patrol lieutenants in my conversations with them have been asked to revisit those goals and have those conversations on a monthly basis with those individual employees. So if you have two patrol lieutenants that are partners on a shift and they supervise, say, 11 patrol officers, they're pulling those patrol officers in each month, sitting them down and saying, hey, how's it going? How's it going specifically with these goals? But like, how are you as an individual? How's it going out on the road? I've noticed X, Y, or Z as far as your productivity is concerned or other things. So it provides a venue to maybe give an attaboy or a pat on the back, or it's a catalyst for a bigger conversation. And then those conversations can really be documented back in that Guardian tracking web-based repository of information that I referenced earlier. And that's been a really great tool for us, which we didn't have in years past. We've had it for a couple years now. And it allows the lieutenant then, or the supervisor, to when it comes time to maybe revisit that annual evaluation or sit down for that monthly conversation, to go into the computer setting or to go in that program, that software program, and pull up all the entries maybe that were made on that officer. And they can say like, oh yeah, that's right. I remember 3 months ago, we had a conversation because we noticed like some of their enforcement numbers had maybe dipped a little bit. And we were just wondering if everything was okay. And it turns out there was maybe a confidence issue that was a result of maybe some knowledge lapse. And we provided some additional training and that seemed to have done the trick. So we do try to track some of that information in a much more real-time sense now to do a couple of things to really create the best officer that we can, but really to spot some of those concerns that might come up in terms of an early warning sense. Like, hey, we should have spotted this a year ago, but boy, we only have one annual conversation when it's time to do an evaluation. We're fortunate enough that we have these supervisors that are really invested, and then we have this opportunity to sit down and document all those conversations. I'm not sure if that helps at all.
It helps. I think that it might be a separate topic for a future.
Okay.
meeting, too. Other questions? Michael?
So, great presentation, by the way. You had 4 questions and you answered all of
Oh,
them.
thank you.
So I appreciate that. One of our roles is to assess and analyze current policing practices and policies, including the implications of those policies. As we go through this, I don't know if we're going to do that collectively at the end, but my impression when I read both of these policies were they're high quality. In fact, I'd like to take the discipline one and share it in my organization. It's really well articulated and establishes progressive discipline. The one aspect I would like you to touch on, though, is what's not included in this topic or context of this conversation right now is the collective bargaining agreement and the union's role in the disciplinary process. Can you speak to that and how that's traditionally functioned within the Wausau PD as it relates to discipline?
So I probably can't speak really great to that, but I have someone who was a past union steward who's been in our recent negotiations with the union, who probably can give a much more contemporary perspective on that question.
Sure. Or I can do my best. One of the criticisms of unions historically has been they prevent organizations from disciplining the employees and it handcuffs the organization to meet their goals. And I think that's maybe where you're getting at with this, like, what role does the union play, and is it a detriment to us managing and holding our staff accountable? I would say it's more challenging when you have a union because you're not just calling an employee in. Our employees have a right when they're under investigation or they're dealing with disciplinary issues to be represented. Depending on the significance of the allegation or the enforcement that we're going to take, that can serve in multiple different ways. It could be a union steward, an elected representative of the union, who attends with that employee. It might be the business agent of that union, which is a business agent for the Wisconsin Professional Police Officers Association. Or in very serious and significant cases, it might be an attorney for the WPPA that shows up and attends. As far as getting information, which is where the criminal and the employment laws separate, we can't force in a criminal investigation an employee to answer questions. In 20 years, I've never had one say, no, I'm not answering questions, but we can't force them to. But what we can force them to do is to answer questions during an internal investigation, and that's where the Garrity warning comes in. And the Garrity warning basically says, as a condition of your continued employment, I'm ordering you to answer these questions. And they know that the Garrity protection is the information that they share under duress, being ordered to answer questions, cannot be used against them in a criminal case. So that's where there's a distinct split between criminal investigations and internal investigations. I would say that the Wausau Police Department, in my time at the police department, has enjoyed a great relationship between the union and management. And I've seen it from both sides. I've been the union steward that an employee will come to me and say, I'm getting called into the chief's office, will you come with me? And I do. And I've been on it where I'm the guy calling the officer in and they say, I'm bringing a union rep with me, and I say, go for it, and they do. And I have not had that be a significant detriment. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of moving parts to the steps, and the steps need to be done in order. And we have found that, who really knows the steps and helps out is the WPPA. And at the end of the day, I believe that our membership of our union, which is the vast majority of our workforce, wants the same things that we do. They believe in accountability. They believe in our core values. So when these things happen, it just really hasn't been confrontational. And the times that it has been, because it's going to affect someone's employment with us, it's worked out well. So we haven't had any significant, at least in my time, issues where we haven't been able to work through it and do it as a partnership as opposed to being in conflict with each other.
If I could just jump in, I had a question related to that, and there's a line on page 9 of this document. It says, information obtained by the internal investigators will not be shared with the criminal investigators, and you touched on that. How does that work, and how is that beneficial? I mean, it seems like we'll shield you from having to divulge things. I mean, it just looks odd.
I'm going to hit pause for a second because I'm pretty sure the chief wants to talk. What's that? You lost it. Is Ben on the WebEx right now?
We're getting him.
Okay.
I just want to let you know that this room will be used at 4:30 for a public hearing, so we probably can't go 50 minutes on your presentation.
Do you know me?
You know me?
We may have to interrupt your presentation.
Sure.
And just pause it until the next meeting. If we get to a critical point, because we are going to need some time for a discussion on the public engagement process. So the question is whether we should start it or hold it till the next meeting. Michael?
I think if we were going to change the order, I'd be in favor of that with the survey, because that's going to take more time to keep that rolling. But I'm actually wanted to add on to Pat's question. I had the same conflict between this Brady aspect or policy that you have, this obligation, and Garrity. I mean, like, that's a conflict, right? I mean, if it's an internal investigation and a criminal one, like, at what point do you start and stop on those two conflicting type obligations? And I think that's the question that you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes they're running concurrently. You can have a criminal investigation that's ongoing and an internal investigation. Now, to complicate matters just a little bit worse while the chief tries to get back on, we can use internally the information gained in a criminal investigation, but the criminal investigation doesn't get the internal information. We might use that internal information to start a criminal investigation with another organization, and there are statutory reasons why that doesn't occur. It's a sticky wicket. It absolutely is. And then when we're all concluded, if there's anything that comes out of either a criminal investigation or an internal investigation in regards to Brady, which is a whole different bag, we need to produce what's called a Brady letter to the district attorney's office, notifying them that all these things existed that might be able to impeach the credibility of the officer. So for example, the easiest one is if we conduct an internal investigation and we tell all officers when they're new, you can make a lot of mistakes here, people make mistakes, but one thing you can't do is lie. And the reason for that is you're swearing to tell the truth and you're testifying, and if you have lied to us and we can prove it, then we have to draw up a Brady letter and send it to the district attorney's office saying that you're a liar. And that Brady letter then gets shared with all the defense attorneys for every case that you're going to make an arrest on. And then if I'm the victim, I don't want the officer that's there, who might have done everything right, have to admit in open court that they're a liar and then expect a jury to believe them. So that Brady letter can apply to lots of different areas. The one that's most common is untruthfulness that gets shared. And then there's a whole different set of steps within the court system to determine whether this Brady letter and information is applicable to a current case that's being prosecuted. And that's a very difficult thing for an officer to get over. So I don't know if I addressed that.
I think more could be done on that. And discussed on it. I still don't get why the information internally, and I'm sure there are some reasons why, in order to get to the truth, in order to solve your personnel problem, you might get information, but it still seems like anything you find out should be shared if there's a criminal investigation, so I don't understand that. But do you want to move on,
Well, I
Mr.
think
Chair?
that's, the core of that is the self-incrimination.
Well, so just to be clear, there is information we can share from an internal investigation with the criminal investigators, like why they're there. But what absolutely can't be used is the interviews, which generally speaking hold a significant amount of the information with the criminal investigators, because our employees are being forced to answer those questions. And a normal citizen, you, me, whether I'm a police officer or you're a citizen, can't be forced to answer questions against your own interest and then have them used criminally against you.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
everyone still enjoys that right, but you don't enjoy that in your employment. You enjoy that in the criminal justice system.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there other questions for them? Yeah, I apologize, but I think we're going to jump to the engagement process.
My presentation will still exist, so I can,
And
I'd be
I'm
happy to attend.
sure you will wow us when you give it.
You have
Well-
time to update the photos to be very compelling.
I'll just be compelling myself, Mayor.
Are we
So,
going to,
and I apologize for taking things out of order, but I think we do need to have the discussion on the citizen engagement process
are
because
we
that
going
will
to finish
drive.
up on this next time then?
Yes, well,
Okay.
we may get to it, depends upon how long the citizen engagement takes, but I had forgotten about the 4:30 deadline.
Okay. very
And
good.
if we're going to honor that, we're going to need to move on to the citizen engagement process. So we will resume.
Just a point of order here for you. It sounds to me like Mr. Klemp North has a question, and it's
Okay.
struggling to get through, and I'm getting that from the chief who's texting me because he can't get through.
Sounds like they can hear us and see us, but we're not hearing them.
Okay, are we on, are you tracking the chats?
Got the chats, but if someone can try and talk, unmute themselves and talk.
Looks like Michael.
They're all,
Michael, if you can't, can you do we have chat function?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the best.
If they could put their questions in a chat and send it?
It's got,
Oh, got something.
why she can't hear us.
okay, I can hear you.
You
Try
can
it.
hear us?
Yes,
Hey, all right.
perfect.
That's great.
Very loud.
Okay, I'll try to talk quieter. Mr. Clem North has a question though.
Go ahead.
Let's talk after him.
Well, so I'll back up a little bit. I'm asking just for the tracking on when complaints come in, is the police department categorizing those? So my experience, I've sat on in Michigan more than in Wisconsin, but I've sat on several boards and commissions about complaints. And how are we, I mean, like on a meso level, on the middle level, on the department level, are we looking at what the complaints are about, right? Because we're always going to get complaints. But is there any categorization of their, force related? Are they race related? Are they, do we have any sort of data concerning categories or trends that we can look at? It would just be helpful for me to understand. So, how many are related to force or et cetera? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And so I keep a log every year of complaints that come in and what the complaint is about specifically. And then I have the files of all the complaints and the investigations in my office. So I can provide all of that to you in terms of what the alleged violation or concern of the citizen or staff member is that made the complaint. I can provide all of that to you if you're interested in that. I can tell you that most of them revolve around some sort of unprofessionalism where somebody feels as if they were, talked down to, or there was an issue with the officer's communication. There are very, very few, probably I could count on one hand in the time I've been chief, the number of complaints that have come in about excessive force or racial discrimination.
I think for me, it would be helpful just to sort of have a sense of what we're dealing with. I think that every profession has complaints, whether you're a teacher or a doctor or a police officer, there's always complaints. But I think as we look at, as a committee and a task force, is what are we looking at? And to have a sense of I don't need to know the details. I don't want to know the details. But what I'd like to know is the trends and the bigger picture.
Yeah, for sure. I can certainly provide that to you. Can I just say a couple more things? I was trying to jump in earlier, Mr. Robinson.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I know you're running late on time, but I think the thing that the task force is really trying to determine, that the mayor has tasked you with, is to figure out, kind of how we handle the actual complaints that come in from our community. And I think it's important to identify that not all departments handle investigations and complaints in the same way. And so, kind of to Mr. Peckham's question earlier, we document and investigate every single complaint that comes in, whether it's an anonymous phone call, an email, a letter that comes in, and we document and investigate it. And that is not true for every law enforcement agency. In fact, I would say the majority of law enforcement agencies currently, they will only document and investigate something that comes in as a formal complaint, written complaints to their department. So they have evidence of much fewer complaints against their officers as a result. And so that's important to identify. And then the other piece of it is that, what are we investigating? What is the level of allegation or violation of policy that gets investigated and documented? So I can tell you, an example of things that we document and investigate are when our officers are involved in crashes. Our standard within our police department when we investigate crashes between citizens is if there is evidence that somebody committed a traffic violation that resulted in a crash, we issue a citation to the citizen that committed that traffic violation. We hold that same standard for ourselves. So when an officer is involved in a crash, if we investigate the crash and determine that the officer committed a traffic violation, they get a citation. We also typically include that within our officer discipline, and they'll receive a verbal warning for violating a traffic law and receiving a citation. We've issued citations to officers for unsafe backing, for inattentive driving when they're looking at the computer and cause a rear end crash. That is very unusual for law enforcement agencies. So we hold officers to a very high standard, and I think that's important for the task force to know. I've said it a lot lately, but it's important to localize the issue and understand what is your local police department doing in terms of officer investigations and accountability. And there are vast differences in those things. And so I just wanted to make sure that I identify to you, the level of violations that we think are important and that the level of accountability we have for our staff. And if I could just say a couple more things in terms of the process, the policies they're very in-depth, they're great policies. At the end of the day, a citizen doesn't have to understand all those policies. If they have a concern, they can call us and just verbally tell us over the phone what the concern is, and we'll investigate it. So they don't need to understand all of the ins and outs of that policy. And then it's also important to note, and Todd talked about this a little bit, that I, as the police chief, I don't have the ability to terminate an officer. That authority rests with the Police and Fire Commission. So when Todd talked about filing charges, that's how we bring a case to the Police and Fire Commission. I have the ability to suspend an officer with notification to the Police and Fire Commission. But if I have intentions of terminating an officer, I have to file charges with the Police and Fire Commission. It's a quasi-judicial process where we put on a case and the officer can put on a defense with attorneys in the room, and the Police and Fire Commission then decide whether or not the officer has committed a violation of policy and what that discipline will be. And then they have the ability to terminate that officer. So that oversight from a citizen perspective happens with that Police and Fire Commission. So, and then complaints also don't have to be made to the police department. They can go directly to the Police and Fire Commission to be made. And I think that's an important thing also to notice. And then lastly, I just want to say that the complaints and the disposition of those complaints are subject to open records. We are obligated to, if we get an open records request about a personnel investigation or an officer's personnel file, we have to provide them notice, we have to provide the officer notice that we are looking at an open records request for their file. They have the ability, same as anybody else would, to file an injunction if they want to try to block the release of certain records based on very specific legal exemptions. Typically that doesn't happen. Typically the officer just lets the notice lapse and we respond to the open records request as we would any other open records request. So there's a lot of public notice and availability for the public to see documents related to these things. And I think that is also an important piece. So thank you. I know we're running long, so I just wanted to get those thoughts out there for you.
Real quick, because we do need to move on, and then we'll
Sure,
take you.
keep it under 1 minute. And I would just say that this city and city council historically have been very supportive of the police department, so much so that when we asked for hundreds of thousands of dollars to put body cameras on our officers, they gave us those. And that's a whole nother component of internal investigations. It's made in many ways it a lot easier to investigate the behaviors of our officers because we can simply push play in Todd's office. So that might be something you wanted to learn more about later on. I just wanted to bring that up because it is a key thing with body camera. When I'm told we got a complaint that an officer did this, the first thing I ask to do is like push play and let us see it. And it's a wonderful thing to have, and not every agency enjoys the ability to do that on Monday morning with a complaint that came in on Sunday. So thank you, and I will be seeing you again.
So Todd, thank you very much for your very informative presentation. Matt, we are going to be anxiously awaiting. So with that, Katie, Mayor, I'm going to turn it over to you for an introduction of the topic. And
Sure. So one part of this task force is that I've tasked you with, and that the council has approved to task you with, is getting the public engaged in a way that we typically haven't in these committees. So, you know, we can't do it on our own, and we talked a lot last month about ensuring that we had the information we were gathering was statistically significant. So there are a lot of different components that we could choose to do when it comes to public engagement. But we reached out to WIPS, and we have the executive director, Eric Giordano, here. And he is going to go over a couple of options that we talked about. He had a lot more options. So our goal here is to pick the right ones for the committee here and get your feedback on the direction we're going. I want to make sure. With that, I can kick it over to Eric, unless you, Chair Robinson, have anything to add.
no, I think in light of the time, I will turn it right over to Eric and Sharon and Ruth.
Okay, thank you. This is Eric Giordano, Executive Director of WIPS, and I'm going to introduce...
Hang on just a minute, Eric. We're having some technical issues. Keep talking.
Okay.
But maybe...
I'm going to actually have Sharon Belton, who's the WIPS Research Partners Director, introduce our project here, or proposal, rather.
Can everybody hear him? Michael?
I'm sharing my slides. Can you see them?
Yes.
We can see them. We're just trying to figure out how to get your voice to be over our loudspeaker instead of out of the TV here.
Okay, would you like me to keep talking, Mayor, or would you like me to wait?
If you wait 1 second, I see that she's adjusting some settings here, so.
Okay. And you ask questions and I can't hear you. I was having prior presentation, so if I ignore a question, I apologize.
Crank up the output volume.
Keep talking, Sharon.
Okay, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Sharon Belton, the Director of WIPS WIPS Research Partners, and almost everything we do at WIPS Research Partners, we do as a team. And on the presentation today, I have Eric Giordano, who's the Executive Director of WIPS, and Ruth Cronje, who's a professor at UW-Eau Claire. And the three of us have worked together to put together this draft proposal for the Wausau Police Task Force on a process for engaging in public inquiry and decision-making as part of the task force's responsibilities. Basically, the full scope of what we've proposed today really touches on a lot of the areas of WIPS Research Partners' expertise, from survey and quantitative data collection to qualitative data collection through the form of focus groups. And really, a key area that WIPS can contribute to this project is the depth of experience that we have in communication and group decision-making. And all of these areas of expertise, I think, can really help inform the process of getting public input into the Wausau Police Task Force. One thing I think it's important to establish up front is that amongst our core values and running through everything that we do is objectivity, credibility, and transparency. We don't take positions on particular issues, and we don't make policy recommendations, and that's not our role in this process. Our role is to guide a objective, credible, and transparent process to get information that can help the task force make more informed decisions, provide that high-quality expertise, that you can feel confident that the information you have is of the highest quality for decision-making. And being part of the UW system, we're able to pull on a broad scope of talent to help facilitate this project. And what I want to do is I'm going to turn it over to Eric Giordano to kind of walk through some of the objectives of the proposal, and then Ruth and I will jump in at certain points in time as well. Try to keep everything on time here. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm assuming you'll continue to manipulate the slides. So really, we have a broader proposal, but today is just an overview of that proposal. And the proposal is based on several specific goals that we were told that were important in a meeting with the mayor, the police chief, and John Robinson, including transparently gathering information to take the temperature of the Wausau community regarding their attitudes towards local law enforcement and the current practice of policing in our community. Providing inclusive opportunities to engage local public voices, particularly from underrepresented populations, to share their perceptions regarding policing goals, tactics, and overall confidence in law enforcement. Examine, and this was something we got directly from the task force's early documentation, was to examine the potential existence and consequences of systemic racism within our public safety institutions and law enforcement procedures. Understand the highest areas of success of current policing practices. So it was really interesting to hear the chief and others, Captain Baton, talking about some of their successful practices in the areas of receiving and acting on complaints, and other concerns that the public may have in fulfilling gaps in those sorts of policing procedures. And then it's very important, we think it's very critical from what we've heard, that it's important to educate the public about the value of law enforcement as a taxpayer-funded provider of essential community services and the good work that they do. And finally, engage in a process that builds and, where necessary, restores trust and confidence in local law enforcement. And so the entire purpose of this proposal is to provide adequate information to the task force to assist them as they generate recommendations for policy changes if warranted and where warranted. So we've put together sort of a multi-step process, and I want to break it down into two phases, because phase one is sort of like the information gathering, and phase two would be more of inviting the public to and engaging with the public to help provide ideas if any are needed for a change. So phase one is a little more concrete, it's a little more understandable, and I think as we go through it, hopefully that will help you. But I'm putting all of these steps together in sort of this outline form because I want you to consider this as not just a process of gathering information, but also as a process of getting the public involved, being transparent, gaining their trust, empowering the public to some extent, and ultimately making recommendations based on the information that's gathered. So the first phase of this is really the sort of a community listening, community survey, and focus groups. And we're going to talk a little bit in depth on each of those. So why community listening? The whole point of community listening really is to set the stage in a very public way that we, meaning the city of Wausau, is actually looking for public input and seeking public input. We think it's an important part of any sort of transparent process in which you wish to engage the public, that there be an opportunity for community voices to be heard. And that sets the foundation for next steps, which we will talk about. So how do you do community listening, and particularly in a COVID environment? It's going to be tricky, but there are definitely ways to do it through online surveys and questionnaires, which can be very simple, open-ended questions that invite anyone in the community to answer, such as how they feel about local law enforcement, experiences they've had with local law enforcement, that type of thing. It can include, talking with different stakeholder groups, doing some preliminary interviews. And so there's a multiple means to gather this kind of information. You can even do this without our help. This is something you could do through your sort of normal public engagement processes that you've already done, like town hall meetings and things like that. So but it's important, we think, to start off with this opportunity for people to be heard. So I'm going to pass the torch to Sharon, who's going to talk about the other phases of this process, or steps of this phase.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So the next component of information gathering as part of this process is the potential to do a community-wide survey. And we're all familiar with surveys. They allow for broad community or public input and allow you to collect quantitative data that can allow us to measure people's perceptions of the police, the extent to which they agree or disagree with certain things that are being done, how, why they feel the way they do. And this is a survey that can be done online and allow for, members of the community to participate. And many communities across Wisconsin and across the country actually do, surveys related to the topic of policing. However, a really important component of a community survey, particularly of this topic, is we need to be able to answer the question about whether the results that we get represent the community demographics. And is the survey results and are the conclusions that we're drawing representative of the community as a whole? Or is it possible that the individuals that responded were more likely to be, represent certain kinds of views? And so if the task force were to decide to engage in a community survey, we'd want to make sure that we really were able to obtain representative responses. It's going to be essential to the credibility of the information and essential to the credibility of the task force to be able to report representative results for the community. Because we do know that there are certain people that just won't respond to a survey, and in order to get that representative information, it may be more resource intensive than other kinds of data collection tools. So the second option with respect to allowing to have broad citizen input into this process is through facilitated focus group discussions. And these are basically groups of 8 to 10 people who get together, and these can be done virtually, and we've had a lot of success recently in doing virtual focus groups. Get people together in small groups to really dig deeper into into the issues and get at insights into why they feel the way they do, and what are some of the concerns that they have, what's the background about why they feel the way they do. And it allows you to understand issues in more depth than a survey. Now, a key limitation to focus groups is that they're not generalizable. You can't really do 3, 4, 5, 6 focus groups and say that they represent the community as a whole. However, they're extremely valuable in getting detailed, nuanced, in-depth information about how people are processing things or how and why they feel the way that they do. So in that first phase, as Eric mentioned, it's really a public information gathering phase. There's 3 components. There's listening sessions, there's a community survey, and focus groups that can provide both quantitative and qualitative information about how the community is feeling about topics of importance to the task force. And that would provide a really good foundation for moving into the second phase, which is sort of the public engagement phase of this proposal. And I'm going to turn it over to Ruth, who has a lot of expertise in this area, to talk about the rationale or why public engagement is so important, and especially in a topic like this.
Thanks, Sharon. I hope you can all hear me, and if you can't, say something. So let's circle back to this whole issue of trust, because I think public engagement at the end of the day is really about trust. We're at a relatively delicate moment, sort of nationally, regionally, potentially even globally, with the relationship of trust between law enforcement and the public. Trust is a necessary component for interaction between the public and law enforcement, and public engagement processes can be a great way to build that trust. But here's the bad news. Some forms of community engagement can actually erode trust rather than build it. So the Justice Collaboratory at Yale University found that providing community members with opportunities to speak with no intention of following their input or suggestions actually undermines trust. So if you publicly engage residents of Wausau around questions of law enforcement, you will necessarily awaken their expectation that their public voice will inform local law enforcement policy and programming in the future. In light of that, we have a few suggestions to make. First, we want to suggest that you genuinely empower the public. We know that the people who are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. So we recommend that you actively involve community participants early in the inquiry phase of the process and maintain their involvement throughout the entire decision-making process. We understand that you need to prioritize the involvement of underrepresented and marginalized groups, and that's going to be more resource intensive for you to get at their voices, but it is very important that you prioritize them. We also urge you to set and manage their expectations. So communicate clearly and transparently about your research goals and your public engagement goals, and be open and realistic about what can and cannot be achieved and how long delivery might take. And then finally, be authentic in the process. So trust that the process of public involvement will actually work, and be prepared to authentically relinquish control to community members. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Eric, correct?
And Eric, I hate to do this to you, but can you try to be as succinct as possible, because we're going to be kicked out of this room shortly.
Will do. So I'll just save it this way. The phase 2 is a lot squishier. It's a lot less defined because we don't really know what's going to come out of phase 1. So when we presented this proposal or made this proposal, we've sort of made a best guess as what a phase 2 might look like. But the truth of the matter is we're not going to bet on this set of phase 2. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, quite frankly. The point of a phase 2 is really to get at, once we know what the public is thinking, how they're feeling, why they're feeling the way they are, then we come to the opportunity of, it may be that the solutions are very clear, that they're technical in nature, and that the police department and the task force that's sort of charged with this can sort of figure out what these technical solutions are without a lot of public engagement, without a lot of divisive viewpoints. However, it's possible that as a result of this initial inquiry, you'll find that there are gaps or there are issues that really have to be dealt with in a more deliberate way with involving the public in a more engaged process. So, we can kind of skip over, frankly, the next couple slides. We've just outlined one possible pathway, which is to name and frame some issues that are complex, to hold some community deliberations, which can hopefully lead to some common ground for action. We've done this in numerous different community settings. It may or may not be necessary here, and we're not going to necessarily recommend it, but we do recommend starting with your public inquiry phase, which is phase 1, which is your information gathering, and then making a decision, an informed decision about what might come next. So I think with that, I'm just going to stop there and see if Sharon has anything she wants to add before we conclude.
Nope, I think in the interest of time, I'll just say, what we provided is really a draft. We pride ourselves on this being an iterative process and a flexible process and a responsive process based on where the task force wants to go and what the needs are. You don't need to do all of this. You can do pieces of it and still accomplish the goals.
So we met with the WIP's representatives last Friday, and I think based upon that, I think what we'd like to do today is get a feeling of how you think about the phase 1 approach, the listening sessions, the surveys, and the focus groups, so that we can do that. I think we had hoped to get into a discussion, and I had forgotten that we had the 4:30 timeline. I think in order to make sure that we have time to have this discussion, can we schedule a special meeting of this group to focus in? It could be on the public engagement process, because it's important that we get, one of the things we're tasked with is getting a feel of what the community perceptions are. And while we are 7 people, we're not going to represent the community. But I'm wondering if we could do a special meeting just to focus in on the public engagement component, bring Eric back for our questions. And I'd like to do that in the next week to 10 days, if possible. Michael?
Yeah, I'd be fine with that, but to give it a little bit of direction to keep working towards that phase 1, defining it a little bit, I just wanted to share a couple things. So the mayor asked us to go back and think about this, and I went back to the task force report from the president, along with the objectives of this committee. I don't know if it's possible with the nature of the survey to survey both within the department and outside of it, but if there's a way to do both, it might be interesting to incorporate that. But again, I don't know if that's possible with the nature of the survey. The second is the recommendation from the task force is that this be done annually. So if we create something, can we create something that could be used again in the future or on an ongoing basis to watch changes? That would be helpful. And then in the task force report, it talked about the National Police Research Platform. I jumped out to it. I did a little bit of digging around, and in there they have an actual survey on police community interaction survey that is going through peer review and a lot of different scientific rigor being used nationally in a lot of communities. So I would ask that we look into that and see, it's from the University of Illinois Chicago, to see if we can use that or if it's proprietary, because that survey, I think, gets at procedural justice, which is what we're trying to accomplish in the survey. But it does not incorporate 2 other elements which I think are important, which is the systemic racism piece and also the human service needs, which I think Eric and his team could do in addition to just being exceptional at administering the survey. So that's what I think.
Thank you. Excellent points. But how are people?
Would it help if maybe Jean sent out a survey, like a couple of date options, to help us pick the next meeting? If everyone can check their email maybe in the next 2 days?
Well, do you have your calendars up? How would Wednesday the 9th be? Surveys are great, but they take time. I'm looking at 3 o'clock on the 9th.
We do it here, there's a 4:30.
I think that if we focus, I think we need to focus in on wrapping up the community engagement process. And time permits, Matt, we'll get to you, but I think this would be a special meeting specific to the community engagement, then we would go back to our regular schedule. So I would think that within an hour, we could be done at that meeting, if the 9th at 3 would work.
I'm currently available.
Let's plan,
Great.
would that work for you, Ben? Eric, does that work?
No, it's Mike.
Mike, that works for you?
Sure. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, and Sarah, does that work for you?
Maybe.
If you said Sharon, yes. Yes.
Okay, and Sarah?
Yes.
All right, then we'll plan on meeting on the 9th at 3 for this, and then our next regularly scheduled meeting would be the 21st. We can talk about that, the timing of that at that meeting, but we need to vacate this room, so without objection, we are adjourned until the 9th, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.